This week on Pocket Pedagogy, we put on our most fetching little sailor suits. When you think of Donald Duck, you probably think of Walt Disney. And sure, old Walt co-created the character. But if you want to credit anyone with making Donald into an international icon, you've gotta look at Carl Barks. Born in 1901, Barks was a very accomplished writer and artist who worked on a lot of different projects in a lot of different media. But his work expanding the character of Donald Duck into his own shared universe is perhaps his greatest contribution to popular culture. Barks got his start at Disney, working on the company's animated cartoons, starting first as an in-betweener and eventually contributing gags to the Donald Duck shorts in particular. He was so good at it, he eventually became a writer and storyboarder on the cartoons, but the working conditions at the studio and his health made him quit the company in 1942. His time with the Ducks, however, was just beginning. Barks started working on Donald Duck comics in the 1940s to make ends meet while he tried to become a chicken farmer. I couldn't really find out what happened to that chicken farm, but the comics were definitely a smash hit. Barks was remarkably talented both as an artist and a writer, and he ended up, with only a few exceptions, writing and drawing around 500 stories over the next 3 decades. The terms of the Disney licensing deal meant that Barks worked anonymously, so fans really just referred to him as the Good Duck Artist, until the 1960s, when clever collectors figured out his real name and he finally received public credit for his work, alongside a second act selling paintings of those famous characters with Disney's surprising approval. Those paintings remain prized collector's pieces to this day. To put it simply, Barks's body of work was voluminous. Drawing from his own experiences, personality, values, and interests, Barks not only crafted stories for Donald Duck and his nephews Huey, Dewey, and Louie, but also a massive supporting cast. Scrooge McDuck, the Beagle Boys, Flintheart Glomgold, Gyro Gearloose, Magica Dispel, Gladstone Gander, the very city of Duckburg, all of them Barks creations. Barks is in rarefied air among Disney creatives, with his characters actually being folded back into the Disney studio productions and inspiring films, television shows, and yes, video games for decades to come. As the late comic scholar Donald Alt put it in an essay published in a Fantagraphics reprint of key Barks stories, he had little success in life when he was not using or creating Disney characters, and yet his work was so distinctive that it actually displaced the Disney vision in the direction of his own individual talent. Barks' contributions made Donald Duck one of the biggest Disney characters, with Donald Duck comics taking their place as some of the most read comics around the world, and in some countries easily eclipsing his predecessor Mickey Mouse as Disney's signature character. Now, we could spend hours talking about Barks' contribution to Donald Duck and the outsized role that Donald Duck comics have played not only in the popularity of the Disney brand, but also as a vehicle for soft geopolitical power and critique. And we will come back to some of that, and I'll certainly post some interesting links in the notes. But the reason I wanted to do this game and talk about this right now is that March 27th of this year would have been the 123rd birthday of this brilliant comics creator. And to that end, I thought it would be nice to celebrate the legacy of Carl Barks with a series of themed episodes of Pocket Pedagogy that we're calling That's quacktastic! So for the next couple weeks, we're going to be looking at the handheld gaming exploits of Donald, Scrooge, and the rest of Barks' famous Duck brood across multiple games, eras, and platforms. So let's talk about 2000's Donald Duck Goin Quackers on Pocket Pedagogy. The Game Boy Color version of Donald Duck Goin Quackers was part of a much larger multi-platform release from Ubisoft, ostensibly in honor and homage to Carl Barks, who had passed away not long before the game's release. The PlayStation, PlayStation 2, Dreamcast, Windows, and Nintendo 64 versions all released just after the Game Boy Color version. And, as a fun aside, the PS2 and GameCube versions of the game were directed by Patrice Désilets, who would go on not long after to create a little game called Assassin's Creed. Now, those console games were all 3D platformers that aped the then popular Crash Bandicoot formula, and this is the one time I'm going to say that the Crash Bandicoot knockoff was better, but more on that in a second. Despite the many differences between the different platform releases, the premise for all of the games is the same. Daisy Duck is kidnapped by the evil sorcerer Murloc, another Barks creation, and Donald tries to rescue her with the help of the mad inventor Gyro Gearloose. He travels across 4 worlds in search of his lady love and the evil sorcerer, and so forth and so on. Look, it's a Donald Duck game, it's not Dostoevsky. The Game Boy Color version differs from all other versions by being a 2D platformer. Donald travels across 4 worlds, a forest, a surprisingly run-down Duckburg, Magica Dispel's castle, and Murloc's temple. Collecting all of Gyro's missing blueprints and defeating Murloc opens up a secret 5th world as well. Each world is split up into 4 or 5 levels, and you can backtrack if you need to collect those aforementioned blueprints. At the end of each world, you fight a boss, which breaks up the proceedings a little bit. Gameplay-wise, Ubisoft was at least trying something interesting. Donald's hit points correspond to his mood. At 2 points he's happy, at 1 point he's angry, and at 0 points, well, he's knocked out. The animations and visuals are pretty good at conveying this once you understand that's what they're trying to do, which is good because the game doesn't really have much in the way of a readable health meter. Donald's fluctuating moods also correspond to the game state. When he takes damage, he goes berserk temporarily and is invincible, and if he eats a special candy, he becomes quote-unquote hyper and can run through obstacles, smash through doors, and break open weak spots in the floor with a butt stomp. From a design and licensing standpoint, this isn't bad on paper. Donald's a notoriously mercurial character, and tying that into the gameplay makes sense. For traversal and offense, however, Donald's pretty limited. He has a double jump and can glide slightly on the way down, but he has no attack button. He can jump on enemies' heads, but it's really just better to dodge them if you can. So a lot of the game is about precision jumping, using the double jump to navigate past hazards, that sort of thing. Frankly, everything in here is, on paper, pretty acceptable for an early 2000s licensed kids game. It looks nice, the music is not great, but really kind of inoffensive, and it's based on one of the most beloved cartoon characters of all time. So why didn't I like it? Look, before we begin, I gotta be clear. I never go into an episode of Pocket Pedagogy looking to bag on a game. I really adhere to the philosophy that it's a miracle any video game ever gets made at all. And the spirit of Pocket Pedagogy is that we can learn from any game, regardless of how well it's actually executed. Also, on a personal note, I find the angry blank gamer subgenre of YouTube videos where people get performatively angry at bad games exhausting. It's some of the most tedious content on the internet. So in that spirit, I still have to admit Donald Duck Goin Quackers is a disappointment. That starts off well, with beautiful expressive animations and levels that are fairly interesting, if not overly challenging. As the game proceeds, however, things escalate, and it becomes clear that the design team, for whatever reason, made choices that actively make the game worse. Let's start with a key takeaway right off the bat: visibility. The player should always be able to read a situation and know exactly where they stand. The best platform games may be challenging, but you're always given more or less complete information of what's on the screen at a given time, and the path should be fairly obvious. Gamers often get upset about so-called yellow paint design, where your attention is drawn to key objects in the environment by specific aesthetic choices that set them apart, like yellow paint and arrows. But being baffled about the way forward isn't really fun either, especially when it's the result of visual aesthetic choice. For instance, where does the staircase go? What beams can I walk past and which ones are effectively walls? What can I climb on and what can I not? What's in the background and what's in the foreground? This information needs to be clearly conveyed to the player, and in Goin Quackers, it just isn't. Especially in the third world, Magica Dispel's castle, which is already a bevy of surprise traps and cheap deaths, the audacity of the developers to also place reflective mirrors in the background that mislead you as to where the dangers and platforms are actually located, because they're often just off to the side of where you think they are, is stunning. Especially on a small, portable screen like the one on the Game Boy Color. Moreover, this game often hides spikes, pits, and other hazards just off screen, only to be revealed by the scroll of the camera. It's unclear whether the developers were taking the reality of screen real estate into account. When you are jumping through the air, it's not always immediately clear where you're going to land, and more often than not, you're going to land on something that's going to hurt you. This is partially due to the odd aspect ratio of the Game Boy Color screen. Even Nintendo's Super Mario Bros. Deluxe remake forced you to manually move the camera, making a game that was second nature to most players a frustrating experience, but that game was a port of an NES game, designed to be played on television. Goin Quackers was designed from the ground up for the Game Boy Color. A platform game where you can't see where you're jumping a lot of the time isn't really challenging, it's just badly designed. Now, this wouldn't be so bad if the game was not heavily influenced by the European design sensibility of platformers at the time. which basically means that most of the later levels are labyrinthine death traps that you can only progress through by finding particular collectibles that activate other collectibles, so you can get another collectible that lets you break down a door and actually progress. And the game doesn't really ease you into this concept either, making for a massive difficulty spike by about World 3. And even that wouldn't be so bad if the game gave you literally any ability at all to defend yourself. Look, Donald Duck is not a passive character. He's prone to outbursts, he's quick to fight, it's his whole thing. Yet this game gives you no actual offensive tactics apart from bouncing off of enemies' heads. No punches, no kicks, he can't even pick stuff up and throw it. Mickey Mouse and the Rescue Rangers were doing that years ago. There's also no run button for some reason. The B button goes completely unused except for the butt stomp you get when you're in hyper mode. You pair those weird choices with the occasionally too floaty physics and questionable hit detection, and it's a recipe for a game where you feel you just don't have as much say as you should over the outcome most of the time. So what do we learn from Goin Quackers? It's simple. Don't let the audio-visual aesthetics get in the way of the game. Make sure that players don't get turned around because of a faux 2D perspective or tricky backgrounds. Be creative and artistic, but always think about how the player's experience is shaped by what they can see and adapt accordingly. Challenge is great. Challenge because of a fake reflection or an unclear path isn't. Oh, and this may really just be personal preference, but collectathons are only fun if you can skip them or just do the bare minimum if you want to actually proceed. Also, character counts, both in life and in game design. Especially when you're working with licensed properties, use the existing creative direction of the character and what players expect from them to build your game. A Donald Duck who doesn't get punchy and start fights is kind of like a Superman who isn't bulletproof or can't fly. Perhaps the funniest part of all of this is that Ubisoft released this game yet again on a Nintendo handheld a year later. It's called Donald Duck Advance, naturally on the Game Boy Advance, and it added an attack button, a dash button, clearer level design and objectives, and really, from the little I've played of it, it's not really a groundbreaking classic, but it's such a better game. Kinda wish I'd played it for this instead. All told, Goin Quackers isn't a total failure, but it's disappointingly shy of being anything other than a cautionary tale in licensed game design, especially when better portable Donald Duck games existed nearly a decade before. I'm Brian Carr, and we'll cover those next time on Pocket Pedagogy. Next time on Pocket Pedagogy, the ducks will continue and morale will improve.